Okay, so welcome back to the last session before Christmas of our lecture series on Stephen Crane's Times. Today's topic is Stephen Crane's Europe and the Orient, and to put it vaguely orientally, I guess I represent Europe, and it's Ergin here next to me represents the Orient. Please introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Ergin, and thank you for joining us. I'm one of the master's students in British and North American Cultural Studies, and we will talk about Crane's Orient and Europe and the idea that he had over what constituted the Orient.
Looking if you're actually visible behind this machinery. Good. So I'll start, then she takes over, and I come back in at the very end. Europe and the Near East, from an American point of view, around 1900, looked like this. So a number of countries over there, the old world, and a lot of Americans, probably more Americans back then, had an idea of what Europe was and where Europe was and who was in Europe and things like that than today. But it was already gradually becoming old Europe, so that over there. And there were a lot of misconceptions about Europe, and even more so about the Orient, the Near East. How did that happen, and how did misconceptions, notably about the Orient, get into circulation? For that, we have to go back to 7 centuries earlier, because this aerial view of Jerusalem shows you the 3 main sites: the the Jewish temple, the Christian Church of the Redeemer, and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. And here's also the different names: Jerusalem, English, Yerushalayim for Hebrew, and Al-Quds in Arabic. Now, the city of the Redeemer had fallen into Muslim hands at that time, and for the first time, or the most serious time anyway, this was a challenge to the concept of Christian superiority. And as you probably remember from your history lessons, challenges to Christian superiority were not taken easily, at least not at that time. Worse, if there was such a thing as a center of science at the time, it was definitely not Christian Europe. It was actually the Arabic world and the Muslim world. Based on, however, a line in the Quran in Surah 17, where the loyal subjects the fidels are asked to pursue knowledge. So from the 8th to the 15th century, the leading culture in terms of studies in mathematics, in astronomy, in physics, and a variety of others were Muslims, which was acknowledged by Europeans, those that were not completely fanatical about it. So somebody like Abu Iwalid Muhammad ibn Ahmad ibn Rushd, which is the bottom line here, were known to Europeans as well, even though under the slightly transmogrified name of Averroes. And to this day, he is one of the most acknowledged scientists. This started changing 5 centuries ago. Anybody recognize this city? Yes, thank you. That is Florence. Florence, just about the epitome of the Renaissance period and the key city to the Renaissance period. Now, if you think Renaissance, who do you think of? Can you name some people? Just throw names at me. I repeat them here. Da Vinci. Michelangelo, yes, thank you. Galileo, Raphael. What was it? Tizian.
Rembrandt, which was artist in the Netherlands.
Dürer Dürer would be Renaissance period, definitely. Nicolaus Copernicus, do we call Renaissance period? Yeah, well, okay. So, the Medici as a sort of power block there. Music, maybe? No, that's Baroque. Architecture?
What?
Architecture, somebody? That isn't architecture, no? Okay, I compiled some people myself. Let's have a look. All of the ones that you mentioned are on this list too. Music, I thought of Orlando Di Lasso, and architecture, Palladio. But the one thing that's noticeable is no Greeks. Mm-hmm. All of these people are Italians. Why no Greeks?
Because they migrated to Italy.
Because they migrated to Italy. Huh? No, all of these people are originally Italian. I mean, we have such a thing as Raffaello Santi's The School of Athens. So Greeks and Greek were somehow on the ticket, were on the larger picture of the Renaissance, but where was Greek in terms of political power blocks at the time?
In the Byzantine Empire.
That wasn't the Byzantine Empire any longer. Hadn't been for about a century. Behind Turkish lines, in the Ottoman Empire. Once Byzance had fallen, Greece became part of that. The Ottoman Empire, in fact, in the 17th century looked something like this. Now, 17th century is also where we already get an idea of America, right? And this is the 17th century of, for instance, John Smith and Pocahontas. I may disappoint you a little bit if I tell you now that the story of John Smith and Pocahontas is not the main text of, or not the main part of John Smith's book that he published about his adventures. In fact, the captivity at the hands of the Powhatans and his rescue by Pocahontas are almost parodic version of two other captivities, one of which is at the hand of Ottomans, of Turks, before, where he, in grand gesture, escapes from them, even shooting 3 Turkish cavalrymen in short succession with the dozens of pistols that he seems to have had on his body. So the Ottoman threat in the 17th century to Europeans, and including British colonial North Americans, was far more visible and viable than any indigenous North Americans could possibly pose. This includes somewhat unlikely sounding threats like the Ottoman raid on Iceland in 1627, where a Turkish fleet sailed all the way there, and from the Vestmannaeyjar Islands, in what to this day in Iceland is known as the Tyrkjanith, captured and abducted something like 400 people to sell them as slaves in the Ottoman Empire. And from Iceland, it's not that far to North America. And in fact, if you look at naval reports and scare tactics, you find that Ottoman fleets having been sighted off Barbados or off the American coast are a recurrent feature in American newspapers deep into the 18th century. When in fact, at that time, the Turkish threat in Europe was already on the retreat. After the Battle of Kahlenberg, 1683, more popularly known as the Battle of and the end of the Siege of Vienna, the Türken vor Wien, where a pan-European army under the command of the Polish King Jan Sobieski had defeated Kara Mustafa's troops and sent them packing, which resulted in a number of other things happening to the Ottoman Empire, like somebody who isn't a threat any longer can then be turned into a commodity. So this is when coffee houses start. That's why we're all drinking coffee rather than British tea with a drop of milk. That's also where carpets come from and horses and so on. We'll hear more about that in a minute. This affected also Americans, if not that immediately as it did Central Europeans. But Timothy Ma is certainly to be followed if he says that the place of the Islamic world in the cultural consciousness of Americans from the 17th through the 19th centuries was more prominent than today's citizens and scholars have previously supposed. For instance, there is a book by Cotton Mather, one of the leading Puritan priests and theoreticians and writers generally, where he bemoans the fate of Greece at the hands of the Ottomans. Note that these American tears are shed upon the ruins of Greek churches, not temples. So this has nothing to do with the Renaissance, in which Cotton Mather and the Puritans were not particularly interested to begin with. But it is one of the starting points of the typically American religiously imbued and religiously influenced Islamophobia and over-identification of Islam with the other, the enemy. Yeah? In Europe, however, old Europe, particularly in the British Isles, with the Ottoman threat receding, they take on another feature, and that is with the rise of the Enlightenment and subsequently the sort of devaluation of the sayings and the teachings of the Church, a number of moral teachings that so far or before the Enlightenment would have come from the Church are now sort of shifted sideways and attributed to Ottomans, or generally to people from the Near and Middle East. And novels and stories like John Hawkesworth, Almoran and Hammett, An Oriental Tale, are generally slightly exotic, sometimes a bit erotic, often adventurous, and definitely moralizing. Hawkesworth conceived of the East at the level of neoclassical generality. So there's the influence of the Renaissance, without much interest in accuracy or specificity of detail, even though that might have been had at the time already. There are a number of visitors to the Orient who write in considerable ethnographic detail about their travels. And they employed a broadly applicable language of abstract morality. These stories were quite literally all over the place. So we shouldn't be surprised if they also show up in American magazines. And I'll focus briefly on one story called Hamet, or the insufficiency of luxury to the attainment of happiness, an Oriental tale. And you can also already notice by the title that this is probably a rather moralizing Oriental tale, and that there is this typical Enlightenment and also early American Republican idea of a sort of relative frugality to, in order as a necessity to reach happiness. However, there's a twist to it. This is not a Franklinesque frugality story. What we're more interested in, however, is the fact that if we look at the very table of contents of this particular magazine here, this particular magazine issue, there's not just this one story of Hamet. There are a total of 4 of them that have some sort of Oriental bearing. And now I need my glasses, because here is Hamet, an Oriental tale. That's the one that's circled in red. But beneath that, there's one called Louisa, a novel, where the title doesn't give away that this is actually a story in which a white woman is made a captive, like those Icelanders, by the Barbary Shore pirates. But she's of such moral beauty, mostly moral beauty, and moral steadfastness that she manages to win over to Christianity and all that, the bay of wherever she is, I forget now, where she's held as a captive. And then there is, further down, a story called Arabian Hospitality. And on the last one in this are lines on the death of a young camel. Yeah. Camels were not native to North America. Some were introduced in the later 19th century by the American cavalry that thought that in the arid Southwest they might use camels. That worked to an extent. It was mostly the soldiers that were kind of, there was too much for them. They should have imported more people to run with the camels. So the rest of those camels were turned loose in the Arizona desert, and some of them lived there into the 1920s. But that's a different story. Hamet, a typical Oriental tale, as I said. Insofar as there is the name, which is easily identifiable as having been borrowed from Hawkesworth. There's also a point in time to which we are directed. And this Hamet, the son of Morad, was descended from the ancient princes of Persia, and notably we get a point in time and in space here by the mentioning of the fame of Shah Abbas, because Shah Abbas is one of the most prominent rulers in the history of Persia. In his days, Persia and the Persian kingdom took on Shiite religion as a state religion, expanded into almost the size that the modern Iranian state still has. The capital at that time, however, was then Isfahan, which just happens to be the partner city of Freiburg. Yeah, thank you. Somehow, if you now feel more connected to this whole story and so on, be welcome. Shah Abbas is also one of the most splendid figures in Iranian history, so he takes on mythical qualities in many respects. Isfahan is also mentioned here in the story, so this Hamid had a fine house and gardens allotted to him in our partner city, which looks like this. Extensive building activity, palaces, gardens are laid out there in the days of Shah Abbas, so this fine house and gardens would have triggered a series of associations, possibly also for American readers. And what's also mentioned as the source of this story is a volume called Wisdom of the Orient. That's probably, that's likely in the original, this book here, which was also rather prominent at the time. However, we learn from Ma and others that these stories were not ethnographically precise stories about these places and about these people. I could go on into some more detail about this. That the main idea and the main point behind these stories was their moral didacticism, writ large, quite literally. And this moral didacticism is supported by the mimesis parameters that you get in these stories. Sparse description of the settings, it's usually just dropping some names like Isfahan, which evoke a set of images. The time frame is Shah Abbas' time, but no further detail about that. The plot is predetermined by the focus on the message, and there is a rather aggravating lack of characterization. So Hamid is a prince, and that's it. There are no ambivalences, no ambiguities, and because of that, the Oriental tale eventually, at the end of the 18th and beginning of the 19th century, is no match any longer for the coming short story. In fact, many short stories of the period and also most of the Oriental tales fall under Eugene Current Garcia's verdict, where he said that whether serious or light-hearted in manner, they were too crudely contrived to command one's respect. Their intended effect being lost either through an underdevelopment of characterization, mood, setting, and atmosphere, or through an overabundance of implausible sensational details of plot and action. That's what happens to the Oriental tale. However, they stay important sort of on the sidelines. I'll get back to them in a minute. The other strongly important import to the US at the time, 18th century, are Antoine Galland's Contes de Mille et une Nuits. Perfect French spoken here, as you notice. In the English language countries known more under the title of Arabian Nights, in several volumes published in English, first between 1704 and 1717. They arrive in North America shortly after. So they become strongly influential to this day. Names like, can you name characters from the Arabian Nights? Ali Baba and the 40 Thieves, yeah, very popular, also as dramatic, in dramatic format. Sinbad the Sailor, and Tinbad the Tailor, and Ninbad the Nailer, and Winbad the Whaler, yes. Shahrazad as the narrator of the conte. Aladdin. Yeah. Of course, Aladdin, the Disney film, that triggered some discussion. So one might claim the Orient becomes part of American culture insofar as these texts are adapted and adapted again and always commodified to the taste of British and American audience. And that also holds true to a variety of other products that become imported and importable now that there are actual trade relations also between the Orient and the Occident.
The representations of the Near East, thanks to the trade routes in America, include the equestrian culture, exotic fruits, and luxury furniture. According to the advertisements in magazines, the word Turk has been in use to highlight the good qualities of the horses. It is likely that horses were called Turks to suggest that they were strong, even though most of the breeds in British North America and the United States were probably Arabian instead of Turkish at all. And while the word Turk in equestrian culture indicated physical strength, the furniture industry had advertised it as a sign of wealth. Different types of furniture became fashionable, while carpets became a 19th century souvenir of the Oriental leisure. So these Oriental objects appeared as status symbols. And this is also seen in Active Service, where Crane also references to the effects of the Oriental practices. His main character's rejuvenated looks are attributed to him going and taking luxury Turkish baths, and people assume that he frequents these places. Another commodity represented with its Oriental connotations is the fig, the fruit. In a story called The Adventures of a Fig, published in Boston Spectator, the story narrates the journey of an unripe fig from the perspective of the fig. Its tree and its growing environment of the fig are depicted as in a very luscious way associated with the Orient. And concerning his life in the Orient, the fig states, There in a climate the most luxurious, I enjoyed every moment of existence. And the fig later on describes how he was shaken from the branches he was holding on to and how he was carried and sent to the west. And the stereotypes associated with the Turk also become prevalent in the narration of the fig while he talks about his life in the west. And the fig wonders why the ladies are not kept indoors as they are in Turkey. And the fig also comments on how the streets in the West are well cared for compared to its Oriental counterparts. Meanwhile, elsewhere? Yep.
I wonder if a fig's actually he. He, she, it. Pronouns. So meanwhile, elsewhere, this is what happens when trade doesn't work properly. At the end of the 18th, early 19th century, the British Empire has a sort of treaty with the Ottoman Empire, and particularly also with those parts that are semi-independent in northern Africa, the Regency of Algeria, the Beylik of Tunis, the Pashalik of Tripoli, and the Sharifat of Morocco, so that British ships can pass through the Mediterranean unhindered and without having to pay any taxes or sort of customs. Americans, even though they've just recently broken loose from the British motherland, think that this treaty still covers them, and much to their chagrin find out that the Barbary Shore, these three city-states of Fez, Algiers, Tunis, Tripoli, do not believe that. And so that American ships are being captured by what the Americans refer to as pirates, and crews often then sold into captivity, white slavery, which is a very prominent topic at a time when the discussion about black slavery also starts to take on momentum and speed, particularly since the American government is supposed to undertake all sorts of efforts to get these white Americans and some blacks, because ships were always desegregated, back when at the same time the maintenance of black slavery in the US is deemed not a subject to discuss in genteel quarters, and definitely not in the South. So this is a huge debate around 1800. Among the efforts undertaken to get white people back are the two Tripolitan Wars of 1805 and 1812. And notably in 1805, the American effort at first goes horrifyingly wrong, and they lose one of their frigates to the Tripolitans, the Philadelphia. And then Americans have always been good at aggrandizing their victories and belittling their defeats, or turning defeats into victories, at least in the mythology. So here, a commando under the command of a young naval officer by the name of Stephen Decatur, after whom a number of places are named Decatur now in the US, manages to board the frigate, liberate the crew, and burn the ship. So destroy it rather than having it fall completely into the hands of the enemy. And this is where one might think in the US Marines hymn, the line "to the shores of Tripoli" comes from. But in fact, technically speaking, Decatur and his men never set foot on Tripolitan shore. That was done already some years earlier in the Battle of Derna, which that way takes on extra fame in 1805. Notably, since if you look at the actual numbers, you wonder how disproportional a battle participation can get with reference to what's being made out of it. I mean, this is the hymn of the US Marines ever since. When in the original thing, at the Battle of Derna, there were, count them, 1 lieutenant and 8 men. And the lieutenant's name, O'Bannon, somehow signals to me, I mean, the Irish, we had that before, right, with Huckleberry Finn. Wasn't quite clear how white the Irish were, if the Irish were actually white, and definitely they were often treated as expendable. And Marines in the early 19th century were also not seen as something that was worth saving particularly. So, yeah, I think I said that before. The United States have always been good at blowing their victories out of proportion. The Battle of Derna, resulting in this. First to fight for right Good. Thank you. Where is Greece in all this? For instance, here. Okay, that's Leo von Klenze, who's actually German. But the so-called Düsseldorf school of landscape painting was also highly popular in the United States. If you've ever seen Washington crossing the Delaware, this famous painting of the boat going through drifting ice and Washington standing there in the bow undeterredly, don't do that when you're crossing a river with ice drift in it. Yeah, don't try this at home. That was actually painted by a German. So, there. Greece had come into the public consciousness more strongly again in the 1820s during the so-called War of Greek Independence. And if anybody here can read Greek, you can identify, where's this going to appear in the YouTube video? Well, anyway, yeah, you can, wherever this is now. The name? George Gordon, 6th Baron. Byron! Yeah, thank you. Actually, that was our Turk here. You can read Greek too. So, a strongly idealized romantic view of Greece and of its people, highly influenced by the perception of the classic. I'll just go back for a second. You know, this is this idealized view as I perceive it. And George Gordon, 6th Baron Byron, had been the key figure of British influence, in particular in this Greek-Orient interface situation. Here he's on his deathbed in 1824 in Missolonghi in Greece, where he had contracted a fever and died of it. That was still a possibility back then. But this did not really prove detrimental for the kind of hero worship that's still bestowed on him in Greece and in Britain, less so in the US. I mean, that's the genial thing, right? You're fighting there with a largely sort of tribalized people, former klefts, so bands of robbers and thieves in the mountains, and a lot of different princes and supposed aristocracy, many of them infighting rather than fighting against the Ottoman Empire, and Byron foots the bills. Yeah, that guy gets a lot of credit afterwards, comes kind of naturally. This is for the Byron death centennial. This is in the back of American minds too, though, as I said, not as prominent as in England. What we see then is this parallelism of an economy that's running on largely luxury goods from the Ottoman Empire, a political line of thought that sees them as a strongly backwards, worse than the Brits, from which one has broken loose, empire, and there are the repercussions of the Oriental tale in American literature, like, for instance, one of my students some years back found out that young Goodman Brown, Nathaniel Hawthorne's very young Goodman Brown, can be read as a conversion or an inversion of the Oriental tale format. Here again we have a young man going out on an adventure into the woods, into the wilderness, but he gets worsted in it. The woods are actually the enemy and contain the enemy. And he comes back and there isn't much of a morale at the end. And then there are Edgar Allan Poe's tales of the grotesque and Arabisk, where the Arabisk is, on the one hand, a type of Islamic art that was used to decorate walls, especially in mosques. But here it's used as almost a synonym to the grotesque. The grotesque and the Arabesque become part of this typical Edgar Allan Poe fear-mongering and all of these strange stories where the Orient and Europe get fused into a mixture and a mésalliance of romantic images. Terror is not of Germany but of the soul, he says, but Germany features quite prominently in Poe's stories, if you look at Ligeia and actually a lot of others. So Europe and the Orient in the European mind in the mid to late 19th century become this mélange out of projected fears, the Gothic, the uncanny, the unreasonable too. They're still having aristocrats around. At the same time, they're the historic forebears, of course. And as such, genealogically speaking, they are also somehow idealized. And then they're ancient and dilapidated, all these ruins, which makes them on the one hand venerable and on the other hand slightly comical. And they're exotic, that's more the Orient, projected desires, sexuality, the erotic. Americans have never been good at that. So there's that otherness also, and there is the luxury, as I said, luxury items largely what's been imported from the actual Orient, so ideas of foreign splendor. Now I know what I forgot, what I thought this morning I would bring, my morning robe. The very idea of a morning robe, Bademantel, is and can be traced to an Oriental influence. The American and the British gentlemen, but Americans actually more so than Brits, in the mornings would dress up in his morning gown, and that would be Turkish influence. Sometimes you even see images of these people with turbans, or what looks a little bit like a turban as made by somebody who has no idea what a turban really is, on their heads. And in fact, politically speaking, if you look at John Sequoyah, the man who's credited with inventing the Cherokee alphabet, you can see that the Cherokee and the other so-called civilized nations in around 1800 start donning what looks strangely like Oriental garb, but these were, of course, those exotic people over there that were being taken seriously by the US government. So maybe if we dress more like them, they'll take us seriously too. Unfortunately, in the case of the North American indigenous people, that didn't work. Maybe they should have dressed up more like Greeks, because there are several waves of Egyptomania in the 19th century. The first one right after the stories from Napoleon's exploits in Egypt in the Napoleonic Wars are spread around the world. And the Library of Congress, in one of its murals, sports a succession of cultures. So there is Judea here, there's Egypt there rather prominently, and right next to Egypt is actually America. And only then, next to that, comes France. So Egypt was somehow something that Americans could identify with. After the American Civil War, a number of Confederate officers that were out of a job started working for the Khedive of Egypt and became officers in his armies. Which brings us to the Holy Land and the influence of Mark Twain. I don't know, I didn't have time to research that, to be honest, whether there are any direct influences noticeable in Crane's works by and from Mark Twain, but Twain, in The Innocents Abroad, had written about a visit to the Holy Land. And here we get back to Jerusalem, which we had at the start of today's session. Twain was not particularly enthralled by Jerusalem, not just by its size, which he thought was no larger than an American village of 4,000 inhabitants, but also he was not particularly taken by the population and by all of these visitors. Mark, however, that Twain was not a Catholic. It's more the Catholic than the Protestant churches of America that still hold the Holy Land and Jerusalem as venerable and in high esteem. The Protestant Americans had made more conversion efforts of people in North Africa and in also Greece and other places, but those efforts were not taken particularly positive and met with sort of friendly responses from the Ottoman Empire. So yes, they were allowed to set up what evolved eventually into a variety of American universities in, for instance, Constantinople, in Cairo, and in Beirut. That exists to this day, American universities in these places. But as far as missionizing efforts went, they started missionizing each other's proselytes. So the Protestants tried to pry away proselytes from the Catholics and the Catholics from the Protestants, and sometimes they started beating up on each other, and the Muslims must have thought that these Christians were completely crazy. But this is the situation that we meet when we look now more deeply into Stephen Crane's actual response to the situation that he meets when he's sent to Greece in order to cover the war that happened there, broke out, was triggered really by the Greeks overestimating their abilities in 1897, at a time when there are a variety of almost comical conflicts between these countries and between the ancient and the modern world, with the Americans perceiving of Europe and the Holy Land and Greek and the Ottoman Empire as somehow backwards, ancillary, tribal, but also quaint and exotic and romantic, as I said before. Oh, whoops.
Thank you very much for all the information, and we will talk about now Stephen Crane's journey, and it starts with a desire to prove the validity of his war depictions in the Red Badge of Courage. So in order to satiate his commitment to truth in literature, Crane thought it necessary that he had to go to Greece and Cuba and see what an actual war looks like, and that actually made him think that his depictions in the Red Badge of Courage were all right, in his words. But when we look at his war dispatches and the letters, they also help us trace his views of the Orient as well. And his war reports portray an image of the Orient fitting with the understanding of the American society of his time, while his letters provide a completely different outlook on the Orient. And we will get to that and talk about that in a bit. So where did Crane think he was going? So Crane encountered different groups belonging to the Orient during his time in Greece. He saw the Turks, the Greeks, and also Albanians who were fighting alongside the Ottomans. The idea of the Greek in the Western mind brings about the thoughts of antiquity due to the Renaissance period, but the modern day Greece had a completely different connotation. The Turk also represented various notions. It was the brute, but there was also the luxury carpets and furniture and all the exotic elements that came along with it. And then Crane's perception of the Albanian Sea does not necessarily dwell on them for long, but he indicates that they're mountain men fighting on the Ottoman side. So there's a tribal element to it. So we must recognize that what was perceived by the notion of the Orient in contemporary times can differ from the perception of Stephen Crane's times. The Orient encompasses different geographies and peoples in different centuries to different Occidental groups. And to understand Crane's opinions and writings on the Orient, it is necessary to realize what his Orient actually constitutes. And the countries that we talked about are what makes up Crane's Orient. So how the East is defined changes according to language and cultural understanding of the geography. So Aynur Erdoğan actually talks about how, when you look at the map of Europe, the Prague lies west of Vienna, but when we look at the associations with Prague, it belongs to the Eastern Europe, while Vienna is considered a part of the Western Europe. And that means that ideological definitions of East and West have substituted geographical realities as a result of political divisions. So in this map, we see Albania, which is technically west of Greece as well, and it is also part of the Orient in Crane's times, even though it is also in continental Europe, and the same goes for Greece, that it is part of continental Europe, but it belongs to the Orient rather than the Occident. And from his various writings, the letters, the war correspondence, his fictional works, it can be deduced that Crane's Orient encompasses all of this geography. That includes also the southeastern Europe. And Crane, prior to his time in the Ottoman lands, was in Greece reporting the war, and he even tried to smuggle 2 Greek brothers as his servants, and then he actually had trouble with the passports, because even from a legal perspective, Greece did not, or the Greeks did not belong to the European land. And then let's talk about Crane's Europe. So first of all, despite being perceived as a part of Europe today, Great Britain actually was not considered a part of Europe. Perhaps today Brexit changes some things, but it is still considered a part of Europe. And the Europe mostly constituted of Germany, Italy, France, Hungary, and there was the rest of the world, which in that case, in the European sense, was actually the Orient. And again, to come back to the passports, when Stephen and Cora Crane actually ask in an American consulate in Europe if they need passports to travel in Europe, that they are told until one goes to Turkey, Greece, or Russia, there is no need for passports. So even based on this documentation, as I said before, Greece and Ottomans were separated from the rest of the West. So that brings us to the concert of Europe. So the Greek population's distaste over the powers, the concert of Europe, and their attempts to slow down the Greek expansion into the Ottoman territories also signify an ideological rift between Greece and its European Occidental neighbors of today. And the Concert of Europe, just to give a vague idea of what it was established because of the Napoleon Wars, and it was to prevent wars in Europe, to keep the European territories as they were, and These countries included great powers of Austria, Prussia, Russia, and the United Kingdom. I am unsure if it's readable, but here we can see Hungary, Italy, France, England, and Russia. And the way that this is depicted, just to take a look at it, I will give you some time to take it all in. Greece is basically depicted as a naughty child because of his actions towards her actions towards the little Turkish boy. Is it good? Can I continue on? So, as an American journalist sent to report the war between Greece and the Ottomans, Crane's war dispatches to New York Journal and Westminster Gazette reflect the Orientalist sentiments of his time in the United States. And Crane describes the Turkish army as insane and wicked. He distinguishes them as the enemy. And his reporting style, according to D.A. Boxwell, holds pro-Greek sympathies. And he also accuses Crane of fueling the anti-Turkish hysteria of his time and whipping up American popular opinion against the Turks. And his war reports set the Turks apart from the Greeks concerning their religious beliefs as well. Crane points to Greeks' Christianity to associate them with the American readers, while he identifies Turks with their Islamic beliefs. He states, who was winning? Was victory with the blue field and the white cross of the Greeks, or was it with the crimson banner of the Muslims? And he makes he repeatedly reminds his readers that the Turks are not Christian, and therefore they should side with the Greek side, and his writings look like he's attempting to garner sympathy for the Greek population and their war. And the war reports depict the Turks in an extremely derogatory manner, describing them as mystical masses, likening them to inhuman creatures and beasts. As seen also in this quote, I will very quickly read this one. It was more than human to see even the color of a fez from the height. As for a gesture, any expression at all, it could not be seen. And this quality provided the picture with its extraordinary mysticism. These little black things, streaming from here and there on the plain, what were they? Turks, Turks, Turks. But then that is a mere name used to describe these creatures who were really hobgoblins and endowed with hobgoblin motives. In the olden times, one could have had a certain advantage if one was anxious about the battle. One could have perhaps witnessed the anxiety of the enemy. Anything is better than a fight with an enemy that wears the black velvet mask of distance. I will just show you an image of the Turkish infantry and an illustration of a hobgoblin, so you can make the distinction of what a hobgoblin and a Turkish officer back then looked like. And as we also see in the quote, Crane's Turks are vague, unknown, and creature-like. It might be hard to believe, but he also attributes good qualities to them. He describes the first Turkish officer he encounters on his way to Greece on Guadiana. It's the ship that Stephen Crane took from Marseille to Greece. He describes the officer as tall and well-made, who has the face of a man who could think, a man who could fight, with a calm, studious expression that one expects in professors at colleges. And as far as my experiences in universities goes, that doesn't look like a professor at a college either. And Crane admits to his surprise because he actually expected a fat and greasy man. And the dichotomy between these two statements is quite obvious. His first depiction of what a Turk is fueled by his American background and the Orientalist ideologies that are instilled in him and that his culture requires of him. Therefore, his encounters with actual individuals opposes depictions of Turkish masses in battle greatly. And here is also another part of the Orient, as we established already, that Greece is a part of the Orient in Crane's times. So let's look at how Crane makes that connection. Crane's mundane experiences with the Greeks and the Turks are similar as well. During battle, Crane observes the enemy lines and notes their uniforms. The Turkish officials wear fezzes, while the Greek Evzones don a small, rakishly practical scarlet fez, as he says. And that's an item, the fez is an item that is associated with the Orient even today. And when you look at the images on the right are the Greek officers, and the image on the left is the Ottoman officers and their uniforms. The one at the top is the Greek cavalry, while the Evzones are on the bottom. And the clothes, again, also indicate the Orientalness of the Greeks and how he actually perceived them. And Crane also, just to talk about other cultural small things that he encountered, Crane also at a Turkish home during his visit to the Ottoman capital is served coffee in priceless china cups. He talks about that very briefly in his letters, but he also talks about this exact same coffee in Active Service, his novel, and he also refers to that as Turkish coffee, and he witnesses many Greek soldiers drinking the same kind of coffee. And even though Crane emphasizes the religious difference between the Greeks and the Turks throughout his war correspondence, Greece is still a land with a mosque and a minaret, which are evidences of a former Turkish occupation, as he says. And the Greeks are not Muslims, but the land they live in carries traces of what Crane's Occident associates with the Orient. In terms of their appearance, Crane also describes both Turks and the Greeks in a similar manner. Crane's Greeks are, as he says, bronze-skinned, swarthy, flash-eyed chaps, and his Turks are swarthy, hard-muscled men. So the depictions, even the words, one of the words that he uses, they're similar. So therefore, we see that Crane's Greeks look more like the Occidental Turks rather than his white American countrymen. And then in his letters after his visit to Constantinople, Crane argues the Turk has been misunderstood to a large extent. We have been taught that his chief characteristics are sensualism and a desire to commit murder on all sides. But after all, the Turk is considerable of a man. He challenges the prejudiced approach toward the Orient by Americans. His various visits to the harem of a prominent citizen assist him in understanding mischief and sensuality depicted by the West is a work of the Occident's imagination rather than the reality. And here is an image, even decades after Crane's time, we see that Americans have a specific idea as to what the harem represents. And Elvis is quite helpful in terms of legitimizing the perception too. And during Crane's time, the American idea of the harem also was similar to this image. And what does Crane say about the harem after his visit? We are somewhat deluded in regard to our ideas of the harem. The word is understood by the average Western mind in rather a wrong way. It simply means that part of the house or household establishment devoted to the use of the woman and is not necessarily a place of wickedness. Not only the wife of a man, but all the female members of his wife's family and his own live in the harem. He has always the pleasure of the company of his sisters and cousins and his aunts, as well as that of his mother and his grandmother, if the latter are not dead. So as you see, this is more the image of the Orient that Crane actually depicts rather than Elvis's version. And Crane also observes the Oriental family life and finds it too sacred to have it open to the public eye. He suggests that the secretive attitude towards the other sex corresponds with the attitude of the clubmen of the Western world. In comparison to his war reports from Greece, his personal letters are in that sense peculiar, because during his short time in Constantinople, he spends time with the Oriental people and readily admits to the incorrect perceptions, the misconceptions the Occident has over the Orient. And it's a big change from claiming that these people are hobgoblins to associating them with the clubmen of the Western world as well. We also get some depictions of the Orient in the great battles of the world. Crane, in his collection of war stories titled Here, features a battle known for the unexpected defense of the Turkish army, the Siege of Plavna. It is still quite famous today in Turkey, but I was surprised that he even knew about the battle at all. And he mentions the battle also in active service as a reminder not to underestimate the Ottoman army. And even though he continues to remind his readers that the Turks are Muslim and they're not Christian and their enemy is actually Christian because it's the Russians, this short story actually holds pro-Turkish sentiments. It's a pro-Turkish narrative. The Siege of Plavna differs from his war reports, which present a pro-Greek, pro-Christian approach. So he compliments the Turks for their defense of Plavna despite having only a shovel for a weapon. He portrays the Ottoman Field Marshal Osman Pasha, which we see a picture of here. He's the one responsible for the troops. He describes him as capable and dutiful. And even though the Turks lose the battle against the Russians, Crane declares, Osman the victorious he will remain, in spite of his surrounder. And concerning Stephen Crane's stance on imperialism and the Orient, the verdict is also quite contradictory. For example, Boxwell claims that Crane's fiction and non-fiction texts on the Greco-Turkish were embodied the imperialist Orientalist sentiments of white American society of his time, while Arthur Gullison claims that Stephen Crane actually was an anti-imperialist and had a good working knowledge of international politics. Which one holds true? The different opinions of the scholars and the different ideas presented in Crane's texts can be explained in two ways. So it can be proposed that Crane's opinion completely changed after his visit to Constantinople, or that his war reports cannot be taken as completely accurately representative of his ideas. And that brings us to yellow journalism. So we mentioned that Crane's opinions of the Orient are a product of his American identity, of his background. However, his writings are also a product of his readers in the Occident, and especially the newspaper culture in the 19th century, which aimed at getting the attention of their readers through sensationalized reports. And the man we see here is William Randolph Hearst. He is Crane's editor, and he was a leading name in yellow journalism. So what is yellow journalism? It is a movement that became popular starting from 1892 in New York and was famous for dependence on the familiar aspects of sensationalism, crime news, scandal, and gossip, divorces and sex, and stress upon reporting of disasters and sports. Newspapers employed lavish use of pictures, many of them without significance, inviting the abuses of picture stealing and faked images, impostures and frauds of various kinds, such as faked interviews and stories. And as we see, therefore, yellow journalism in Crane's times played a role in his writing, since if he did not actually write in this specific way, if he did not conform to it, his articles, his works would not be published. And he actually experiences that a couple times himself, and also talks about his distaste toward yellow journalism, but he is in a way forced to follow it as well. And Crane himself admits that correspondents sent exaggerated reports only because of the demands of the editors, as the editors wanted tales of heroism, blood, death, victory, or defeat. Therefore, it can be suggested that the editor's insistence also played a role in the way that he writes. And then we also see this effect, this change by his editors when we look at just the titles of some of his correspondence. Hearst sensationalized some of his articles called that was the romance, the red badge of courage, a story. This is the reality, a battle today in Greece, a fact, and the blue badge of cowardice. And if we just look at the names even, we realize that these are some of the titles of his reports from Greece. Therefore, Crane's reports, we have to realize that Crane's reports were written for an audience and he had to follow some of the rules as well. But that does not necessarily mean that there weren't some parts that he actually wrote Orientalist ideas. And we see the yellow journalism and his distaste for it also in active service through the two characters that he actually created, Sturgeon and Coleman. And Gossen suggests that Crane seems to have modeled the editor of Eclipse, Sturgeon, on his conception of Hearst. And Crane presents Sturgeon and Coleman as men who do not have any sympathy for the news that they review, but only consider them in terms of the public reaction that they can create. And Crane's distaste for American yellow journalism, which dictated all of his reports, are also discernible in the entire text. Coleman suggests that in active service, he could imagine how the American people, vibrating for years to stories of the cruelty of the Turk, will tremble, while the newspapers howled out the dire possibilities. It was the romance of the Wainwright party in its simplicity that to the American world was arousing great sensation. So this is the way that they actually depict the story, because the whole storyline that we see makes it to the American newspapers, and all Coleman can think about is how it will be sensationalized. And Crane, through Coleman, depicts the effects of yellow journalism and how the kind of effects that it has over the conception of the Orient in the Occident's mind. And even though the Wainwright party never encounters the Ottoman army, the newspapers would remind the readers, the population, of the possible horrendous outcomes that could entail. And then these newspapers also try to create some sort of a romantic hero out of Coleman. So let's take a general look at active service and how Crane portrays the Orient in this novel, other than his distaste for the yellow journalism. Crane employs cliché characteristics associated with the Orient that we talked about previously, and he satirizes these and the Occident and its ideas of the Orient in general. And Crane's active service, yes. And Crane's... I touched it, that was an amazing moment. And Crane's active service is a romantic tale, just so you have an idea of what it is. It is a tale between two Americans set in a war-ridden Oriental land. So the book itself, due to its cliché love story plot, garnered a really bad reception from critics. However, it remains a source for understanding Crane's Orient regardless. And critics also, as I said, diverge in their view if the book is to be taken as a parody of norms, which I believe also persists in a lot of his books as well, to create parodies of situations and cultural settings, or if it is actually just a badly written romance. And Crane, by employing Orientalist stereotypes, mocking his Americans for their actions, depicting the Occident as clueless to the life in the Orient, creates a parody of the Oriental mindset of the 19th century America. And active service, despite taking place in Greece and depicting a war against the Ottomans, does not portray the Turks beyond expressing the opinions of people and the fear of war and just the image of a Turkish body at the start of the narrative. So we barely have any Turkish representations. However, the novel does not, as I said, contain any representations of the Turks, but it does contain representations of the Greeks. But how is Turkey represented? Let's look at that first. It basically is that Crane repeats the sentiment of the American public rather than talk about individuals. So Turkey at that time was believed to be a country of delay, corruption, turbulence, and massacre. More than half of the Christians of the world shuddered at the name of Turkey. And Crane's Rufus Coleman, as a white American, shares the exact same sentiment as well. He blanches at hearing the Wainwright party has traveled to Greece, to the Oriental land. And however, Crane's explanation is nothing beyond stating the general American opinion. And active service provides descriptions of Turkey that critics have considered extremely Orientalist due to its dark, ominous description of the landscape. Turkey presented nothing to the eye but a muddy bank with fringes of trees back of it. It seemed to be a great plain with sparse collections of foliage marking it. This is a quote from the active service. However, despite this ominous portrayal, we also see Crane suggest that right after this specific quote, it is actually the Occidental mind that recognizes it as such, and it's the fear and the restricted state of one's sight in war rather than an actual reality. And he suggests if Coleman had known anything of war, he would have known from appearances that there was nothing in the immediate vicinity to cause heart jumping. But as a matter of truth, he was deeply moved and wondered what was hidden by those trees. So Coleman's feelings upon seeing the Turkish landscape parallels the sentiments of the Occident towards the Orient in general. Despite nothing being hidden on the Turkish side of the border, the Occident mind wonders in fear and fascination. So Crane also suggests that fear is a result of the restriction of the Occidental eye. So therefore, the distance and the lack of knowledge concerning the Orient is the cause of the Occident's idea of the Orient rather than the Orient's actions. So how about the Greeks in active service? Because they are the most represented part of the Orient in the book. And it's also an Orient that Occident can associate with because of their religion. So Crane, as he does in his war reports, identifies the Greeks as a part of the Orient as well. And Coleman, as some of the quotes suggest, that he specifically refers to the Greeks as a part of the Orient. So Coleman suggests, Coleman drives his dragoman into a curious state of Oriental bewilderment and panic. He also describes how oddly the Greek dragoman delivers a message as his Oriental way of doing it. And then Crane presents the chaos prevalent in the train station also as the Greeks' Oriental fashion too. So anything that he sees negatively, anything that he cannot make sense of, is explained by the Greeks' Oriental ways. And Crane's narrative in active service also presents Greeks in a mocking and derogatory manner. And despite his experiences with the Greeks during his time reporting the war, in active service he employs them as foil characters to his American Coleman, the white romantic hero. And Crane's dragoman is cowardly while Coleman is declared as a brave hero because the dragoman does not want to cross the Turkish border into the war-ridden land, while Coleman is ready to do it for his great love. And despite this, despite the appearances, Crane does not depict Coleman as a hero in the romantic sense as well. This is just how it looks at first glance. He comes across the Wainwright party accidentally, and the Greek officer that they encounter with Nora Black is also mocked for his affection towards her, but he is technically the one who saves them all and gets them out of the land that they're in from all the war. And then after Nora Black actually finds out that the Greek officer actually belongs to a quite wealthy family, the entire dynamic also changes. And as we can see, Crane is also not always kind to his Americans either. They're incapable of handling themselves in times of war, and they're in need of help. So there is no American white hero, in fact, in his storyline. And the Orient by them is seen as either a horrendous, murderous land, or it's just an exhibition setting. So just to conclude, to wrap up what I have talked about so far, but Stephen Crane's portrayal of the Orient is a rarely talked about topic. However, his ideas are not that homogeneous. It is a more heterogenic collection of views rather than just the American point of view in that time period. And as a citizen of the United States in the late 19th century, Crane is situated in an Orientalist position. This is not to say that that he states the Orient is not what the American population perceives. Does not necessarily mean that he is not in an Orientalist position. However, his writings also indicate that he acknowledges the inaccuracies. So, thank you.
And that's pretty much it. One more thing, a little bit about the active service novel, which we have here as a first edition. Crane did, as I said before, write books sort of against the grain somehow. Maggie is a parody of the sentimental novel of the period. The Red Badge of Courage can be read in two directions, as a critique of juvenile heroism or as a first blood story. And in fact, in active service, the encounter with the dead body of a Turkish soldier, the only Turkish soldier they see throughout the whole book, is an indication that this is also a sort of adaptation, because there's a similar scene in The Red Badge of Courage. Besides, if you look at the monument of activity to the war 1897 on the Arta River, you notice that this is the place where the active service is located. And this place is quite a ways from where the real action took place. Crane sets his novel in Epirus, on the left-hand side, circled in blue here, where practically nothing happened during this short but brutal war. Whereas the real fighting took place elsewhere. That's where Crane is supposed to have been. And that's where he made some of his experiences that went, for instance, into a story that I will recommend to your attention if you have time to spare, called Death and the Child. How much of the action Crane actually saw himself, we don't know. There are the pictures that were taken of him sitting on faux terrain in a German-run photographer's studio in Athens on May 20th, 1897, after returning from the front, but there are also reports that say that he was quite sick. He had dysentery and was laid up for a while in during this relatively short period. So some of his battle reports may in fact have been written by her. Strangely enough, her picture, according to the inscription at the bottom, was taken a day after in the same studio and in front of the same faux terrain. This is Cora Crane writing under the name of Imogen Carter, and at that time possibly the first female war correspondent, also wearing similar clothes to what Crane's wearing in this image. So if Crane was writing another sort of ambiguous and ambivalent adaptation, parody of a common type of book, it would have been an adventure story, and there were these war adventure stories written by war correspondents, people like Rider Haggard, the British adventure author, or Davis, the William Harding Davis, who even met Crane at some point, and they all wrote these stories that were full of daring do and adventure, whereas Crane writes a book where nothing happens, where a bunch of idiots are running around in the countryside that's supposed to be war-ridden, but there's no evidence of war. They're American archaeology students, but they're actually looking at Roman remains in Greece, and the town of Actium in Epirus. They're constantly afraid of something that isn't there. Unfortunately, if you write an inversion of an adventure tale, you end up with a boring adventure story. And that's what happened to Active Service, which has not received a fraction of the attention that Maggie and The Red Badge of Courage and Crane's poetry and many of his short stories have drawn on them. So maybe it's a book to rediscover, if only for the purposes of literary scholarship and of learning more and understanding more about the relations of Americans to old Europe and the Ottoman Empire. Thank you very much.